in general, the literature also supports this idea that, and I think it's reasonable, it supports the idea that what's really bad is low levels of muscle mass, sarcopenia, dyspnea, so the lack of functional muscle tissue. Like that's what's associated with higher all-cause mortality, worse cancer outcomes, things like that. And those cutoffs kind of differ from study to study, but I usually think about it in terms of FFMI, or the fat-free mass index, which was basically you take how much you weigh, you remove some estimate of your body fat percentage, and then you calculate the same way you would calculate a BMI. So divided by your height in meters squared. And this is kind of, of other things like some studies use, like you mentioned, the appendicular lean muscle index, which is something that we also tried in our paper. That's basically you have to do a DEXA scan. You then have to calculate how much muscle tissue is in your arms and legs. It's just more difficult. Whereas an FFMI, you just have to have some estimate of your body fat and your weight and your height, and you can get a pretty good idea. The cutoffs, at least when I've looked at the data and other studies seem to agree, is that for women, the risk really starts to increase for things like all-cause mortality at FFMI below 14. And for men, it's about 17. Of course, there's like a buffer there. You don't want to be right on the cutoff. And different people, suggest different cutoffs. So probably something closer to 19 for men and 17 for women. And, hopefully that's something that most people can calculate. And that's where once you're at those thresholds, that's probably enough muscle tissue. Like we don't yet have this good evidence that more is better above that point. Except for one study that came out recently that looked at this across, they took 7 different data sets and they looked at FFMI and all-cause mortality risk. And they said, well, first of all, that the relationship between FFMI and mortality was the same in men and women, which doesn't make sense because men and women have, in general, different amounts of muscle mass relative to their height. And then they said that the cutoff for the lowest risk was an FFMI of 22, which is pretty high.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah, that's pretty athletic there.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, great. Like if you get an FFMI of 22 is great. But I think this was another example of people looking at the data without really knowing what it means. So for those who don't think about muscle mass all day, an FFMI of 25 is this sort of theoretical cutoff of where you can get to without performance enhancing drugs. Of course, there are people who are above that just by accruing large amounts of total mass, and we see that in the enhanced data set. But for athletic individuals, 25 is high. And so trying to get close to that and thinking that that's where a general population would see benefit, I don't really believe that. So I think, somewhere around 19 to 20 for men, 16 to 17 for women, I think that's probably the sweet spot. And then above that, we don't really know whether there's more benefit.
I think that's really important to point out because there's a lot of talk about BMI and a lot of talk about body fat percentage, but there's not a ton of discussion of what low muscle mass looks like, how much fat-free mass an individual should have. Now, where do you think, when we talk about fat-free mass index, are we just talking about skeletal muscle mass, or are we talking about all fat-free mass?
Yeah, so it's all fat-free mass. And again, if you're trying to isolate the effect of just muscle tissue, then something like ALMI, the appendicular lean muscle index, that's useful because you're just looking at skeletal muscle and you're just looking at it in the limbs, which is where you're maybe most active and it's most related to physical activity. However, we know that the other components of FFMI, like bone, are really important, and so that kind of gets rolled in there. And in our study, we found that the relationship between low muscle mass, either as ALMI or FFMI, and cognitive function was essentially the same. And I think that including bone in there is helpful in some ways because we know that bone is incredibly important, again, for preventing fracture risk. But then it's not just this completely dead weight that holds your body together, right? It's an active tissue, just like the muscle is. So yes, FMI includes all of your lean tissue, but I think there's some benefit from including that.
Don't you think that it's interesting that our ability to specifically and only look at skeletal muscle is a bit prohibitive? They're talking about, I'm sure you've seen some of William Evans's data, he's starting to look at D3 creatine as more specific ways to look at skeletal muscle. But, essentially, we don't have a great way other than perhaps CT, MRI to identify this tissue, which is a secretory organ and a whole organ system.
I think there's two sides to it. One is like there's the pursuit of knowledge mechanism, like really understanding what's going on, and that's important, right? I think that's incredibly important. The sort of this pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and we don't know when what's just knowledge will actually become useful things to apply in real life. Well, that's always a part of science, right? You'll discover something now that isn't useful for 20 years, and that continued pursuit is important. But then the other side of it is like, what are the practical things that individuals can take away that they know is useful, that has a meaningful implication for their lives? And that's where I think simpler measurements and tools become important. So FFMI, like you just remove the body fat component, you estimate your lean mass, and it's important for a whole bunch of things. So when we're thinking about the brain, there are now several studies that show it, either looking at brain volume or brain atrophy, so like how much your brain shrinks with age, as well as elements of cognitive function. If you're thinking about body composition, muscle mass is the best predictor of those things. So muscle mass is more important than fat mass. It's more important than BMI, and we're like so hyper focused on body fat. When actually,
I know.
particularly for the brain, but a whole bunch of other things, like muscle mass is the thing that we should care about. And I like that as a takeaway because it's also weight neutral, right? I don't care about the mass that you exert on a scale, like the force due to gravity, right? What I care about is how much functional muscle tissue you have, and that can improve and increase regardless of anything else. And that's something that I think is really positive. And that's what we should be telling people about.
I mean, I pretty much think that we should stop the podcast here because that is the most critical statement of all time. And you and I could not be more aligned. Again, you are one of the only people that I have heard discuss it in this way. And I just feel so much in alignment with everything that you're saying. It's incredible. Yes, we are hyper-focused on adipose tissue. It's interesting. There's all these theories and paradigms of thinking, and we've been so fixated on obesity numbers. For example, we know that 73% of adults are either overweight or obese. What percentage of individuals have healthy muscle mass? We don't even have that conversation. No. We have no idea.
Yeah. And it's probably, and that's like mixed in with this. Oh yeah. So first we just say, well, do you have enough muscle mass? But nobody asks, well, is that muscle useful or not? And I think that's really what's so important. And again, it's something that it doesn't take much, right? Any movement to stimulate that muscle tissue is, particularly in people who are sedentary, has multiple beneficial downstream effects. So just small things, like even with the muscle you have, right? Improve the muscle quality of the muscle that you have, right? That is likely to have incredible benefits. And so. I mean, one thing that is important, right, while we're talking about this, is like where the message is coming from. And so I have a story about you, which I think is really, really important. You don't know this story, but I'm going to tell you. No, it's good. It's great.
It's okay. Yeah.
So we'll start by saying that most of the time when I talk about muscle tissue, like I can see people roll their eyes. They're like, calm down, bro. Like, clearly you love bicep curls. So, like, why should I don't want to look like you. And of course, that's not what I'm saying. Like, we already said that, like, more isn't necessarily better. Like, I like to lift heavy things. It's what I do for a hobby. That doesn't mean you have to. But I do think that you could do some more muscle strengthening type activities and it will have a great benefit to your health. So the messenger becomes important here as well, because often people are talking about muscle mass are people who have a lot of muscle mass, and the listener might not appreciate that. So I was at a conference for the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine last September, which is now the second largest lifestyle medicine society in the world, and I'm one of the founding directors and trustees. And I was speaking to a GP there. We were just like sat in the back of the audience. We were having a conversation. And I was mentioning that I was about to go on my friend Rangan Chasterjee podcast. You've been on his podcast. And what he said was I'd given a talk about muscle mass and all-cause mortality and mortality risk. So that was what my talk was on. And he said, I've been telling my wife that she needs to lift weights for years, like the importance of muscle tissue. And like, she's just ignored me. She's like, just hasn't sunk in. But then she hears you on Rongan's podcast and she sends it to her husband and says, look, here's a woman talking about muscle mass. Now I think I should go and lift some weights in the gym. So sometimes you need to hear this message from somebody who's like you. And I think that's really important. So why am I saying that? It means that somebody who's listening to this, you have a sphere of influence of people who are more like you, who are maybe more likely to listen to you than they are to listen to me, right? And I've seen this in multiple other scenarios, particularly with women, where they would prefer to hear this message from somebody who's more like them. So say a postmenopausal woman, hears a message about muscle mass from another postmenopausal woman. Great. So everybody just realize you have your small group of people who are like you, who you can influence. And that's how we spread the word and get this stuff out, just like bit by bit within our own groups. So that was a little tangent, but I think it kind of relates to getting this message out.